Pam, it's so great to be with you and have the chance to talk a little bit about some of the passions that we share. But before we get to Rosenwald, I'd love to hear a little bit about you. Where did you grow up, and what kind of experience did you have with travel and historic sites as a child?
I've lived and traveled to a lot of places. It started at a very early age. I was born in London, England. My parents met there when they were both working there in their early 20s. And by the time I was 8, I had lived on 3 continents.
Oh my gosh, where?
Spent a lot of time traveling. We moved from London, England to Southern California. We lived in a couple different places there based on my dad's job. We did a lot of travel to national parks. It was a big part of my childhood, getting in the family station wagon, visiting those sites, seeing all the history and all the natural wonders as well. And again, for my dad's job, he got transferred to Australia.
What kind of work was he doing?
He worked for an oil company. And it was still, he loved the outdoors. He loved to be out in nature. And so that was a big part of our travel growing up. We moved to Australia, and it was a lot of the same. We got to see a lot of the places that I probably would not have otherwise been able to go to if my dad hadn't been transferred there. Spent about 3.5 to 4 years in
Sydney, or?
No, in a small town, actually called Sale, that had about 3,000 to 5,000 people at the time. The closest major city was Melbourne.
Oh my gosh.
Fantastic. A lot of great family photos of me with feeding the kangaroos as a young girl.
That's an amazing part of the world, isn't it? Yeah.
It really is, and a very unique history, I think. Amazing country, and it was a wonderful experience, but it was nice, I think, for my family to settle down again back in the United States. We moved to Houston in the late 80s, and my parents have been living there ever since. We continued that tradition of traveling since my mom's entire family lives in Scotland. We've been. So
your mom is British?
She is Scottish. Yep.
Scottish.
Yep.
Okay.
So we've spent a lot of time there and exploring the history of the United Kingdom a lot as well as a kid. So it's been a long road of travel for me.
So learning history via sites is something that you really grew up with.
Absolutely, and I think it's something that I'm glad that my parents prioritized when we went on family vacation. While we enjoyed going to amusement parks as a kid, it was always nice to
and beaches.
And beaches. You know, I'm glad that my dad loved national parks and would drive to great lengths to make sure that we enjoyed those experiences and got to see all that the National Park Service has to offer at their sites.
My gosh. So when it came time for college, where did you go?
I stayed in Texas, actually. I went to the University of Texas at Austin, and I always had a passion for history and for politics, which started in high school, actually, with me joining the debate team. And I carried that forward into college and ended up with a degree somewhat related to historic preservation regarding urban planning, and my minor was in history. And so I got to have a little bit of that combination carry through to different parts of my career later on.
Had you focused on American history in your minor, or
a mixture? Yeah, a mixture of American history and world history, and it was really nice to get that dual experience that I didn't realize then was going to take me to a historic preservation career later on down the road.
Yeah. So how did all that happen?
I really think it started with joining the debate team when other people were probably asking for different things for their holiday gifts. I was asking for a subscription to Newsweek and Time magazine, so I had more.
In other words,
exactly. So I wanted another resource for me to be able to do research for my debate competitions. I ended up really enjoying debate in high school, and I didn't think I would. I was actually painfully shy. Hated getting in front of the class to make a presentation, and debate really helped me with that. Not only public speaking, but also research skills and public policy analysis.
Putting ideas in order and organizing your thoughts.
And persuasive writing, and really trying to make the case for why different types of public policy or legislation should be passed. I ended up debating in college as well, and even coaching college and high school teams afterwards. And I think that love of debate legislation and politics really led me to move to Washington, D.C. and start my professional career here.
So straight out of college, you came to DC?
Yep, straight out of college. I actually, that was my first job was on Capitol Hill. I met my congressman, Lloyd Doggett, who represented the Austin, Texas area. I moved up to Washington, D.C. to work on his legislative staff. Did some amazing projects while I was there. And as part of that, I realized I really wanted to get experience working in the nonprofit sector, really helping do grassroots advocacy, getting people to engage in the legislative process and really, do some good within nonprofit organizations. So I ended up leaving and working for a nonprofit human rights organization for about 5.5 years. Realized I missed Capitol Hill, and I went back.
The intensity and the excitement is probably somewhat addictive.
It is. It's nice to have access to a wealth of research information, be part of, what's happening on Capitol Hill and really helping get laws and things passed. That was what I really wanted to do. And I wanted to get some more experience that I hadn't already gained before I left Capitol Hill again. And I had decided a long time ago, it just wasn't for me to work behind a desk in a traditional job, and I really wanted to be doing more grassroots work and stay in the nonprofit sector. And so for all of that 20-year period, I've either been on Capitol Hill or working as a lobbyist and an advocate for nonprofits here in Washington, D.C.
And so when did the National Park Service enter your life? Except for all those trips to Grand Canyon.
Except for the travel.
Yes.
I always had in the back of my mind that I loved travel, I loved history, I loved historic sites, and I happened to have this urban planning degree that's related to historic preservation that I'd done absolutely nothing with. Like I know that a lot of people face sometimes in their career that they haven't really used that degree. And I decided I wanted to do that. And a job opened up at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It was not only the combination of doing government relations work and advocacy work, working on legislation, obviously for things to do historic preservation, but it was also to do public lands work. So a big part of my job is to focus on preserving historic and cultural sites within the National Park Service and also the Bureau of Land Management and other federal agencies as well. So as part of that work, I do a lot of work with different congressional offices and our partners around the country. If we see opportunities for historic places or cultural sites that could be deserving of a National Park Service designation in some way, that's a big part of my job, to explore those opportunities, to develop legislative proposals and work with everyone to see what we can get accomplished.
Well, that makes you the perfect person for the Rosenwald Park campaign.
Yeah, it was a joy to be able to take on that project as one of the items on my plate a few years ago. And a lot of the beginnings of the project and this campaign and what the board does predated me a little bit. A lot of the conversations the National Trust had with board members and with the National Parks Conservation Association about building this initiative. But once that came to me, I was thrilled to be a part of it. It was right up my alley.
Were you familiar with the story of Julius Rosenwald?
I was. It had been part of I'd learned about it in college. I think that what I found so fascinating about it are all the multi-layered histories related to not only Julius Rosenwald, but some of the other interconnected issues just over the past few decades. I found that a lot of my work at the National Trust would have references to Julius Rosenwald or Rosenwald schools without me realizing that that was going to be the case. So it's really been not only a historic learning opportunity for me, which I enjoy, but every time I interact with the board and work on this project, I learn more about just the amazing stories of people and how they've worked to preserve these schools and what they meant for those communities.
And of course, you're involved in another project that has to do with people working to advance educational equality, and that's the Topeka, Kansas.
Right. I've been working with a group of members of Congress and communities in 5 different states to pass legislation that would tell a more full or complete story of the landmark Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. Right now, in the kind of the national consciousness of this country, the preservation within the National Park Service of buildings related to that court case are really located in one building in one school in Topeka, Kansas. And what the public may not realize is that landmark Supreme Court case was actually a consolidation of 5 different cases, which include 4 other states with some communities with amazing stories of leadership, courage, activism, a lot of women's history component to each of those. And we're having a conversation with Congressman Clyburn, who's leading this legislation in the House of Representatives, and he said, why don't we take this on as a project? It was something the National Trust for Historic Preservation was already interested in, so we took it and ran with it. We developed a 2-track program over about 1.5 years where we went to each of those 5 communities, talked with them about what buildings they thought represented that court case, and really made a contribution to the full story of Brown versus Board of Education. And my role in that process was to develop the policy proposal about how we would protect those buildings and make sure we get them into the National Park Service so that the public can learn about each of these court cases and see the full story of that.
And if that actually happens, that would be a discontiguous park in the way that the Rosenwald Park will be.
Exactly. It's a really innovative format, but one that I think we're starting to see more of. There's certainly precedent for National Park Service units to be located in multiple places. Another example of that are the Manhattan Project sites, where you have locations in Tennessee, New Mexico, and Washington State. And I think what's interesting about that is, we need to remember that sometimes the history of our nation is not in one individual building or in one individual state. And it's often a network of communities that have built that history over time. And so I think things like the Brown versus Board of Education legislation and the Rosenwald campaign are ways where we can tell the story about really the depth and impact that certain individuals and communities have had in many parts of the nation.
And kind of emphasize the fact, as you said, you used the word community, emphasize the fact that these are not things that happen because someone has the idea that they should happen. They kind of bubble up from below. People want them, and that's why they happen.
Absolutely. And there's, been about 5,000 Rosenwald schools. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has been working on this since the early 2000s. And part of our research from back in that time, we realized that only about 10 to 12% of those schools remained. And so I think that's why this Rosenwald campaign is so important. This really is an opportunity when the Special Resources Study concludes for the National Park Service to have a unit that not only tells the story of Rosenwald schools, but also the incredible impact that Julius Rosenwald had.
So Pam, you have a lot of experience in this area of working with government to make these things happen. What's your sense of how this will unfold for the Rosenwald Park campaign? How long it will take and what the steps will be?
Well, I think the great thing about the legislation that passed a few years ago is not only how much support we saw from organizations around the country, communities that have Rosenwald schools at those locations, but really on Capitol Hill as well. We saw no opposition to this legislation. It was really well received in committee. I think the outlook is good. We've seen a lot of bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate, and I think a lot of the research that this campaign has done, and other organizations as well, really about the impact that these places have had in their communities, but also the threat as well, to how many we've already lost, and the importance of preserving them as soon as possible is something that I think is a really powerful argument for the campaign and our supporters to be making when we get to the next phase of the legislation. So I think the outlook is good. I think the campaigns, they've done tremendous work. I think the organizational support letter, having over 100 organizations, is going to be a powerful resource as we have those conversations on Capitol Hill. And I think all the groundwork's been laid for getting this passed as soon as we have an opportunity.
How many Rosenwald schools have you visited yourself?
I'd say it's under 10, certainly not as much as other board members, especially due to the pandemic. A lot of my travel work travel has been around National Park Service units, and my other big travel recently with getting married was my honeymoon. So there's not been a lot of other time for Rosenwald school visits, but it's certainly on my list.
Do you have a favorite one of the ones you visited?
Actually, I really liked the Ridgely School, where we all had our board gathering. What I really loved about the classroom was all the artifacts, the big, huge windows that let in the light. You almost felt like you were going to school, and it really took you back to your childhood as well, trying to imagine how the students were learning and interacting with everything in the room.
It's true, going in those classrooms does make it real in a way that reading about it doesn't.
Exactly.